could even tell you an interesting story, if you would like.
We would.
T. John would love to have the car, the governor's car, when Romney would leave the state. And every now and then Romney would go out to Salt Lake City because of his Mormon connections. When T. John had the car, he had a habit of not smoking a cigar, but biting little pieces of it off and spitting them out. And Lenore didn't like that when the car came back. So she told George, don't let him have the car. So there comes a day he is invited to go out to Salt Lake City, and he leaves without telling T. John. It just so happened that Judge Gillis on the Court of Appeals was at the airport and saw Romney leave. Gillis goes down to his office and bumps into T. John. And he says, I hear you're governor today. And T. John says, I didn't know that. What do you mean? Well, he said, I'm going to call and ask for the car. So T. John gets on the phone and calls Governor Romney's secretary, Peg Little, and says to her, I understand that the governor has gone to Salt Lake City. And Peg said, yes. He said, well, I want the car. Peg said, you'll have to talk to the trooper, who was Neil, who sat right next to her at the office. She turns the phone over to Neil, and Neil says to T. John, the governor says you're not to have the car. And T. John says, listen, you is talking to the governor. Peg, while this is going on, is calling me in my office and telling me all this, saying, what do we do? I said, you give him the car, which we did, which is a very interesting story.
I can tell a little sequel to that. Bill Marshall worked for the CIO at that time and had been a CONCON delegate. He and I were at the Old Olds Hotel, and T. John called us pork choppers. His pork choppers, I'll be buying the car.
Oh.
And he picked the two of us up, and we went on our way to Hamtramck. And that was quite an evening, I can tell you.
Nice.
That T. John knew how to live, and he had that feeling about the car that he was the governor. And I can see how that
T.
happened.
John was a very colorful person and a very good administrator. He ran a very successful court.
Well, one thing he did, in California, the Court of Appeals is divided, and the fiefdoms kind of the same ones, where T. John, as I understand it, insisted that the judges rotate, so you wouldn't have judge shopping by the lawyers. In other words, if you had just Upper Peninsula judges in the Upper Peninsula, it'd be an entirely different setup. And I think it's a very sound administration. Can you want to comment on that? Do you think it's good that the Court of Appeals judges didn't have specific geographical areas?
I think it was much better that we didn't, that we could sit statewide rather than, as in Ohio, sitting only in our little narrow district.
Yeah.
In other words, T. John, coming from Wayne County, if we had the system of representing, being a judge only in your own district, would have constantly served only in Wayne County and two small counties.
Yeah.
I think it's much better. We are on the Court of Appeals. We never were, and I still believe we continue not to. We are not split on Republican versus Democrat.
Yeah.
The splits on the Court of Appeals are more on, are you plaintiff-oriented or are you defendant-oriented? Yeah. Or are you really tough on sentencing or are you more moderate on sentencing? Those are the issues rather than the Republican-Democrat.
And it's not bound by geography.
And we're not bound by geography.
I remember as the opposite, I had a matter in Wayne County, and somebody from Wayne County wanted to be disqualified and get someone from a different part of the state to be at the hearing. So there's the very opposite of Ohio and California, where you tend to gear in on a geographical location. So I think that's been very interesting enough on the apportionment. I think Judge Danoff said that the Court of Appeals was the one body we created on a one-person, one-vote basis, a strict population. The whole
Yes, that's true.
Constitution.
Yes.
That's a little side point. Do you have any more experiences on CONCON you want to talk about?
No,
How
I
about
don't
the
believe
Court of-
so, Tom.
how
You've
about
asked
the
me
Court-
all sorts of questions.
How about the Court of Appeals? Or do you think the Court of Appeals has been successful? That was created as an intermediate court. Do you think that's been a good idea or not?
I think intermediate court has been a very necessary idea.
Yeah.
Yes, because without it, there would be no remedy for the losing party at the circuit court level.
Yeah.
Except for the Supreme Court, there would be too many. The Supreme Court can hardly handle the case that's coming to them now.
Yeah.
We actually act as a screening court.
Yeah.
3/4 of the cases, are actually the court of last resort rather than the Supreme Court as a practical matter, because most of at least two-thirds of the decisions which the Court of Appeals make are approved by the Supreme Court.
And how many are even not appealed to the Supreme Court? I mean, people have the decision of the Court of Appeals, and those are not automatically appealed to the Supreme Court.
You have no automatic appeal from the Court of Appeals to the Supreme Court. It's on a permission basis.
Yeah. And actually, I think many people, when they have their hearing in the Court of Appeals, the result is they take that without without even trying to get leave to appeal.
That's right.
Well, Judge, we certainly appreciate your coming and taking the time. I'd kind of like to wrap it up. Now, do you want to tell a little bit more about what you've done since your term was up on the Court of Appeals and why you didn't run again?
I left the Court of Appeals because of the age limitation on January 1st, 1987. And in the intervening time, I've sat back on the Court of Appeals from time to time, but also I've acted as trial judge, as circuit judge in Mackinac County at St. Ignace during the summers. And in order to get there from my cottage, which is at Mackinac Island, I take the ferry. So I say I'm the only judge in Michigan who goes to work by ship. Since I've left, the two new judges took my place, and place of the judge who also retired with me. Coming on to take our places is Judge Betty Weaver, who's now on the Supreme Court, and Judge Hal Sawyer from Grand Rapids.
Well, Judge, I want to thank you very much for taking the time and giving us that practical insight. I'm sure the Michigan Political History Society will appreciate this. Let you know the tapes then go to the Political History Society, then to Wayne University, Michigan State University, and the University of Michigan. So this does make the information available.